Test, 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 test. Test, 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 test. Okay. We're ready? Okay, we're ready. Yeah, please. Wait. Well, whatever. Sorry, I'm just trying to. Hey, there's no screen here. The presentation is not on here. Okay, great. Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming here today. Really appreciate your attendance. We're excited to present to you our civil society point of view on this session on trade and circular economy. So the session is titled Circular Economy for a Just Energy Transition. It's about the enrichment of critical raw materials value chain in extractive regions in the reglobalization context. It's the full title of our session today. Unfortunately, out of 5 of us that were supposed to be here, 2 of us had travel visa issues as well, so could not make it. So unfortunately, the content of our presentation has been reduced. We hope that we're able to at least give you an exciting panel, at least with the limited people that are here. But one of the people that were supposed to be here, in case you might know her, is Sabine Rao Oberhuber, who from Turn 2. She was supposed to speak about materials as a service, so a new type of economic model for circularity. And then we also had Jessica Orellana from IDA, who is not unfortunately here. She's from Ecuador, where she's working with IDA, which is an environmental NGO in Latin America. And she basically is going to would have focused on environmental taxation, ecosystem services related to mineral pricing. On Sabine's presentation, won't go into her presentation because materials as a service is still kind of a new topic for me. On Jessica's presentation, I will a little bit try to at least incorporate some main key points, even though Jessica's not here today. So just that with that caveat, I would like to present myself and the rest of the panelists. My name is Diego Marin. I work for the European Environmental Bureau. We're the largest network of environmental NGOs in Europe, encompassing around 180 member organizations. And I'm leading the work on raw materials and resource justice. And to my left,
I'm Olaf Tolk. I work for Handel Anders, which is a Dutch trade coalition network consisted of different civil society organizations. And I'm policy officer, critical raw materials.
and last but not least.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rita Tedesco, head of energy transition at ECOS. So we are the Environmental Coalition on Standards, and we are an international NGO with a broad membership now going at global level, consisting of 56 environmental civil society organizations. And we represent environmental interests in mostly in standardization processes at, for instance, ISO, IEC, and we also work on technical policies.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you, Olaf. Perfect. So with that, maybe we can put on the next slide. Oh, I actually have the power to do that, I guess. So before the way the session is going to go, it's each of us, we're going to have 10 to 15 minutes for a presentation, and then we'll open up the floor for discussions. And now, given the fact that we have 2 less panelists, we will have more time for discussion and interventions. So just want to really quickly highlight the Raw Materials Coalition, with our organizations are members of, encompasses around 55 civil society organizations, mainly in Europe, but some increasingly in the Global South as well. We are representing 18 different countries, and there is our website as well. You can follow some of our research from different civil society organizations. And we're trying to basically form a more united approach towards the raw materials challenge from an NGO level perspective, towards that could really enhance and move towards just energy transition related to critical raw materials. Next slide, please. Okay, before I get started, I think this is really important because sometimes we get really hung up on the economic incentives, on the geopolitical dynamics, and we seem to forget a lot of times what we mean by sustainability. What is this trade going for? What is it going towards? And one of those biggest impacts is the planetary boundary framework, which is one of the key frameworks to help us analyze economic activity on a global scale. From 2009, we have seen that when it was just first implemented, first studied by the Stockholm Resilience Center, around 3 planetary boundaries had been crossed and around 7 boundaries had been assessed. We have a total of 9 boundaries now in 2023 that have been assessed. Out of those 9 boundaries, 6 of them have been crossed. And on the right-hand side, you can see the economic impacts of economic ecosystem disruptions. This really incorporates how deeply bound we are by our ecosystems near us. As you can see, maybe it's a little bit hard to read there, but this recent research, I think came out a week or 2 ago, finds that bat decline, so the loss of bat populations, leads to an increase of insecticide use by around 31%. This is different locations that he studied, which basically translates to human infant mortality increasing by 8% in the counties that experience bat die-offs. So what this means that bats provide basically a service, if you will, of eating insects, and these insects that would have otherwise eaten agricultural goods have now to be compensated for the bat die-offs through insecticide use, which also impacts human health. So this is one key point of what this really means when we talk about planetary boundaries. We are deeply intertwined to our economic activities and therefore our ecosystems. This other point is also on the Global Resources Outlook. This is from this year. It defines the material footprint increasing from 1970 to 2000 and is rising at an exponential scale, meaning that by 2060, the overall use of economic activity from materials that are used in the world will increase by around 60%. Remembering that 2023, we have already crossed 6 planetary boundaries out of 9. Correlating that number to that 60% increase by 2060 we're talking about severe ecological strains. And on the left-hand side, you can see how biomass have actually, or I guess human-made materials, anthropogenic mass, has surpassed the amount of biomass around the world in terms of tonnage. This is severely concerning for basically the world. Next slide. Okay, so now getting a bit more into the specifics here. We're talking about the global footprint. We're talking about global material use rise. As you can see on the left-hand side, this again is from the Global Resources Outlook 2024. You can see that Eastern Europe, and North America highlighted on the highlighted red there. It shows that the material footprint of the United States, or North America, I guess, Canada and the United States, incorporates around 30 material tons per capita, down from 36 in the year 2000. Now contrast that to Africa. In 2000, Africa consumed per capita around 4 tons of material footprint. 20 years later, it only consumes 5. This is severely under what is required for good living standards. And this is in the global north, we can see that material consumption has decreased to some extent, but not enough to bring us back to what is called planetary boundaries type of consumption and production. So it really spells a bit of a reality check on what our policies are trying to achieve. What are they geared towards? And then maybe just really quickly when we talk about critical raw materials, we really need to emphasize the current policy approach. And at the moment, there is, I'm particularly referring to models, right? Models of material demand and what have you. On the left, and how, in a sense, very much so, they are underlying on specific assumptions that create self-fulfilling prophecies in a sense. On the left-hand side, we can see that economic, social, and lifestyle assumptions mix with the technological objectives. So what can actually be achieved at this moment, which incorporates sub-technologies, lifespan of materials, mineral intensity, collection rate, etc., lead to international reports and academic papers lead to EU national level policies on raw materials, which then lead to international trade agreements, financial support to corporations, and lastly, and more importantly, to extractivist conflicts. And that's what I would like to assess on what the missing pieces are here. And there's some research that we did with UNESA. This is some research that I was one of the authors with some others as well. This was a research that we did with UNESA under the Resource Management Young Members Group, as well as with the Sustainable Development Goals Delivery Group. Sorry for all the acronyms, which is under the expert group on resource management at UNESA. And what we were looking at here is really trying to analyze and to problematize the fact that the idea of avoid, shift, and improve, which is really the sufficiency framework, more or less, which is suggested by the latest IPCC report, is largely neglected. And in current policy mechanisms, only improve and even increase takes priority, whereas avoid and shift are largely ignored and out of the picture of policymaking. And this, what it does is a huge missed opportunity, because in terms of different models, which I can go more into details, they provide alternative demand scenarios that in some scales can even reduce lithium, cobalt, nickel demand by around 50%. Some more ambitious ones, and in a little bit more time trying to push the boundaries of what can be perceived as achievable, even suggest that lithium consumption, can be reduced by 90% in the United States, car-centered United States. And this is some research that was done by Climate and Community and Climate Institute. So in this report, it just came out today. Actually, we're just putting it out. It came out technically last week, but we're having like a soft launch, I guess, right now. And I'm just putting the link in there. You can find out more details on it and about what we mean by sufficiency policies and how this can be one of the biggest levers for raw material demand, which go above and beyond only resource efficiency or even recycling. And we propose a problematique, this schematic right here. We're talking about sustainability, and the fundamental thing about understanding sustainability is that at this moment is being really used as a buzzword. And what this does, it really omits what we want to achieve. And at the moment, we can look at sustainability from two perspectives: strong sustainability and weak sustainability. On the strong sustainability part, natural capital is non-substitutable. And this would imply an anti-extractivist approach, right? And before I get more into that, maybe I should start off that there's a bit of an impasse right now, a puzzle, let's say, a dilemma. Basically, it means that the world needs raw materials, of course, for the energy transition, economic development, what have you, and digitalization. However, as we already know, these rely on energy-intensive sectors such as the mining sector, and what this does, it has real-world implications on communities on the ground, on water availability, on ecosystem services, on biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. Not only that, but also on corruption, on profit shifting, et cetera, et cetera. And what this does in that sense is that, what we need to figure out at the moment is, on one hand, we do need these materials. On another hand, they're ecologically polluting. And on the other hand, these are disproportionately impacting local communities such as indigenous groups around the world, and even uncontacted tribes as well, particularly in the Amazon and in Southeast Asia. And what this does is it creates an impasse, right? So how do we actually overcome this puzzle, this sustainability dilemma? Well, looking at sustainability, again, like I mentioned, from a strong sustainability perspective, when you assume that natural capital is not substitutable, that implies an anti-extractivist approach. And an anti-extractivist approach, to its fullest extent, would save ecosystem services, of course, but what it would do, it would actually create intra-generational justice, because as you remembered from the material footprint graph that I showed, countries in Africa, in Latin America, and Southeast Asia still need to increase the level of consumption and production. So adopting an anti-extractivist approach to the fullest would create other issues. However, to adopt a weak sustainability approach, where we assume that natural capital is substitutable, which is actually the current policy approach, this basically would mean, in essence, mine first, ask questions later. And what this would do is would lead to a further ecological collapse. But how do we solve this situation? Well, we propose an intergenerational justice dilemma approach to this by promoting demand side solutions. Again, avoid, shift, and improve as suggested by the IPCC. Could you remove that? Sorry, the other thing. What this means is that demand side measures, sufficiency measures, but also circular measures, recycling being one of them, repairability, reusability, all of these measures are needed to satisfy the demand side solutions. And what this would do is it would satisfy the anti-extractivist approach because it would reduce the amount of mines that are needed. Just to give you an idea of what this means, Benchmark Minerals Intelligence suggests that 386 new mines by 2035 are needed to meet the world's climate goals. If you take into account recycling, this number drops down to around 336, meaning that roughly about 40 mines are offset, right? However, there is no sufficiency, avoid, shift, improve type of measurement within this analysis from Benchmark Minerals Intelligence. So if that were to be done, then obviously the amount of minerals and mines that are needed would be reduced. And from a weak sustainability standpoint, we still do need materials, but this would imply extraction with guardrails, meaning that for capital that is critical, meaning like the deep sea, the Amazon, extremely rich biodiverse areas, the precautionary principle should take place. And for non-critical capital, meaning that areas that are deemed able to be mined for different reasons, then the polluter pays principle needs to play a role there. And we'll talk a little bit about what these two mean. I mean, basically this presentation here is about extraction with guardrails. What does that look like? So I'll leave it there for now for this demand side solutions. One of the actual interesting kind of new approaches that are being discussed, at least with extraction with guardrails, is about mineral pricing. And in this sense, what does ESG premiums on minerals could look like? At the moment, London Mining Exchange is looking into this. They're still assessing. The issue with ESG premiums, however, is that there is no universal agreement on what ESG metrics consist of. Aside from that, there is it's also this is the ESG premiums are also being discussed even with policymaking within the EU and Australia Memorandum of Understanding, which is recently announced there. But they're still exploring that. I don't have a lot of details on what this ESG breakdown could look like. But one of the suggestions by IDA is to look into the value chains, to look at it from a raw materials perspective within Latin America. And they've done some research on, well, they're starting to do the research, I should say, on incorporating ecosystem services into mineral pricing. This is the presentation that Jessica would have given. So I won't go too much into details on why this is needed. I mean, that's kind of already been reflected in my presentation just now. But one of the cases that she's studying is the lithium triangle. And as you can see here, incorporates Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina. And where there is a large population of local communities and indigenous people that depend, of course, on the ecosystem, on their ecosystems, cultural and socioeconomic well-being. There's a lot of issues with water, for example, as well, and including agricultural and industrial development. So mining is not only one of the extractive activities present in the lithium triangle. There's also tourism, agriculture, like I mentioned, mono-agriculture that is also imposing issues on water systems. And so they propose moving towards a world where we can actually incorporate ecosystem services within mineral pricing. Unfortunately, because Jessica's not here, I won't go too much into detail. This is also something that they're trying to, at the moment, incorporate. So the details are still in the early stages, but that she did want me to at least highlight that the idea for this is to mainly generate revenues for to ensure a fair share of directly affected community through benefit sharing. And also it would allow for increased investment in technologies to advance circular economy more efficiently. And then also lastly, but also importantly, is to ensure that adequate compensation for the contamination of extractive activities are reflected within the pricing. this is still to be seen. I mean, like I mentioned, London Mining Exchange is currently looking into ESG premiums, and I think some of us here already in the audience might have more expertise on this as well. So would love to hear your feedback on that point. But I'll move on to now the presentation from Olaf, who can you, sorry. Oh yeah, there you go. To break us down into the Critical Raw Materials Act, and then to give us also the challenges, but opportunities also within a trade perspective on critical raw materials. Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about the Critical Raw Materials Act. First of all, what is Handel Anders? Handel Anders is a coalition of different civil society organizations. For instance, labor unions, farmer organizations. We have environmental groups, and we all work together to strive for a fair and sustainable trade. And in that sense, I have researched the Critical Raw Materials Act. So first, I'm going to describe what the Critical Raw Materials Act exactly is. And then I'm going to talk about to what extent we think the Critical Raw Materials Act is a step towards a circular economy or not. So the Critical Raw Materials Act was launched as part of the Green Deal, specifically the Green Industrial Plan. The goal of the Green Industrial Plan is to create a European industry that is clean, that does not commit a lot of carbon, and that therefore will be sustainable. That is the premise of the Green Industrial Deal. Specifically, the Critical Raw Materials Act within the Green Industrial Deal is to secure a steady supply chain of raw materials. So this industrial plan will be dependent on many different minerals, and the European Union has grown after the Ukraine invasion by Russia, wary of supply chains disruptions. So the Critical Raw Materials Act was launched as a way to ensure that sufficient raw materials will be available for European industry. Now, there is some mining in Europe, and the Critical Raw Materials Act also states that they want to increase mining. But for the most part, these minerals will have to come from other places. I think that the goal in the Critical Raw Materials Act is to have 10% extraction within the European Union. So that means that even if they reach the goal, 90% will have to come somewhere else. Now, how does the Critical Raw Materials Act do that? What I argue, we're publishing a report in 2 weeks on this. What I'm going to argue is that they basically have two mechanisms in order to get access to these minerals. The first one are free trade and investment treaties. And this is something that we've known for a long time. This is old-fashioned European policy. So we establish a free trade agreement with a country in order to ensure that trade is not hindered, and we establish investment treaties in order to secure the rights of investors. And sometimes they're also combined. So a lot of times a free trade agreement encompasses an investment treaty. Now, secondly, what I'm arguing is that with the Critical Raw Materials Act, there's also a form of what I call an extended industrial policy occurring in the European Union. And the way this becomes manifest is in strategic partnerships. So strategic partnerships are a voluntary agreement between two countries in which usually what is kind of the deal is that raw material exporting countries will provide minerals, and in exchange, Europe will invest in either infrastructure or green tech or in upstream industrial facilities. These are non-binding treaties, but I do think that these represent an interesting shift because, in a way, what the EU is saying with this second pillar is that we will still continue doing free trade on a global scale, but we see that there's significant downside to it. So, for instance, we see that refining often happens by Chinese companies. So, and we don't want that, and therefore we're going to subsidize or incentivize certain economic activities in order to combat that. And that's a wider, I think, a wider economic philosophy shift that's being translated into the trading system with strategic partnerships. And a second thing that is often talked about is that these strategic partnerships are meant to create local value in raw material exporting countries. For instance, in the EU-Chile strategic partnership, von der Leyen explicitly said, okay, we are the European Union. We don't just extract and leave. We ensure that there's higher development and that there's local value creation within Chile. That are her words basically. And the strategic partnerships are meant to create that. Now, to what extent, I'm going to talk about how each of these two pillars, so the free trade and investment and the extended industrial policy, contribute to a circular economy or not. So we start with the free trade and investment treaties. And the thing with free trade agreements is that they often hinder government intervention. So examples for that are, for instance, Indonesia, they imposed a nickel ban or a ban on the export of raw material of unprocessed nickel. And the reason why they did that is because they wanted companies to refine the nickel within Indonesia. So that's why they put up a trade barrier. Another example is Chile. Chile wanted to enact a policy of double pricing to give raw materials cheaper to companies that were refining them in Chile than to companies that were refining them in other places. And the third example is Mexico that tried to nationalize its lithium industry in order to get a bigger share of the value that's being created in lithium. The thing is that these free trade agreements, they often are meant to prevent these matches. I mean, the word itself is a free trade agreement, so that a free trade is basically trade without government intervention. I mean, I think it's more complicated than that, but I mean, in general, maybe we can say that. So yeah, we could say that is a big hinder for countries that have a lot of extraction to integrate into the world economy. Now, secondly, investment treaties. The most significant of the more salient issue in these investment treaties are investor-state dispute settlements. This is a separate legal system that investors can trigger in case they think that they're being unfairly treated. Now, the problem with this is that that is kind of a broad definition. And in the mining sector, we've seen very often that this is used, for instance, to prevent environmental legislation or to ensure, for example, in Pakistan granted a company the rights to search for minerals, but then after they found it, they did not permit the actual extraction of the minerals. Now, Pakistan was charged for 6 billion euros in this system, and I think that at the end they settled for 5 billion or something like that. So yeah, I think that would be a hinder to creating a circular economy. Same thing in Colombia. There was an environmental legislation, and after Colombia enacted that legislation, they were charged for 700 million euros, dollars, excuse me, and they also lost that. They lost that case as well. So yeah, in this sense, both these instruments are meant to not have any government intervention. So yeah. And in the case of Chile and Mexico, there have been recent free trade agreements between Europe and Chile and Mexico. And in this case, we see that investment treaties are still part of these free trade agreements. So in that case, they come hand in hand. So they're together. Now, secondly, so we're talking about these strategic partnerships. They are part of the extended industrial policy, so Europe that is financing or actively encouraging certain projects in other countries. Just to say, it's not just strategic partnership. There's also other programs. For instance, the Global Gateway program, which is a program meant to create infrastructure or green tech in other countries. Now, the problem with these programs is that there's often no enforceable mechanism for human rights and the environment. So these are often sometimes they are mentioned. So, for instance, in the EU-Serbia strategic partnership, there is a mention of OECD guidelines for the environment, but there's no enforceable mechanism, unlike often in free trade agreements where government policy can actually be if a government tries to enact a policy that is at odds with a free trade agreement, a company can go to the WTO, and this lacks in strategic partnerships. So I think that that's a hinder to the circular economy. And lastly, also the premise is often that the strategic partnerships are meant to create local value. However, what they often fail to mention is that the reason why mining does not bring a lot of, sometimes doesn't bring a lot of local value to begin with, is that a lot of the money that is, or a lot of the value that is created in mining is flows out of the countries due to tax evasion and corruption. And we've seen a lot of examples of that. For instance, and the EU actually is complicit in a lot of these cases. For instance, in Mongolia, there was a report that a Canadian mining company used Dutch and Luxembourgish subsidiaries to avoid 470 million in taxes. In case of corruption, there's a very well-known case of Dan Gertler, which used his ties to the personal ties with the Congolese president to get parts of mining facilities in Congo. And he was put on the American sanction list, but after he was put on the American sanction list, he just started trading in euros instead of dollars. And in that way, he was able to evade sanctions. And until this day, he has several subsidiaries in the Amsterdam financial district. So we also see that, okay, there's this talk about local value creation, but there's kind of a dual role for the EU here. So then to answer the final question, do we think that the Critical Raw Materials Act contributes to a circular economy? What we're basically saying is that if you want to have, in this model, we use the word climate justice, but I think it's somewhat similar to circular economy. So if we want to achieve that, we'll need to have 4 different pillars: economic reform, some form of public investment, true value creation in the global south, and this needs to be broader than just economic value creation. For instance, if value creation is accompanied by large environmental destruction or human rights issues, then okay, is that truly value creation? And the material footprint needs to be reduced. Now, the Critical Raw Material Act in itself talks about three of those different pillars. So there's some public investment. They talk about value creation in the global south. They talk about a reduction of material needs, but economic reform is not at all part of the Critical Raw Materials Act. By the way, we're not saying that the other 3 pillars are being done enough, but economic reform is not even mentioned. So therefore, we think that the model that is presented in the Critical Raw Materials Act mostly does not represent a form of climate justice, more a model in which public money is being used for private capital. And we think that at the end of the day, that will not be sustainable. So that was it.
Okay.
I'll
pass it over now to
Rita.
Thank you, Olaf. Let me see if it works. Yes. So this is the last presentation for today. So I will focus on the role of international standards in in circularity and what they can do to actually enhance just energy transition. And so what I will look is also what is the links with what are the links with trade, and how can we ultimately get to to the full sustainability through demand side measures, as Diego also explained at the beginning of the presentation. As I said, I'm not going to reintroduce ECOS again, but we are the environmental correlation standards, and our specialty is really standardization processes and how, well, we don't only defend environmental interests there, but we also try to make it easy for civil society organizations to have a voice there. So what is, you can also see the full slide, but what is the interlinkage between international standardization and trades? Probably this is really evident, and you probably know a lot. I'm sure there are experts in this room that know about what is the link between standards and trade, but just to repeat it again, and anyways, I will not be the first person this week. Standards, international standards, and I mean standards developed by the organizations that you see on the screen, so ISO, IC, and ITU, help overcome technical barriers to trade. So the WTO agreement on technical barriers to trade has actually been done to avoid that standards impede impede trade exchanges, and the agreement also calls for the standards to be used as a basis for technical regulations by WTO members. This also means that if standards are really ambitious, they can really be an opportunity for, especially for, in this case, we're talking today about mining regions, to enhance sustainability and circularity within these regions as well. But how can there really be a benefit for society and the environment? We have a proposal here that is a recipe for standards to actually really work towards a just energy transition. And there I will talk about three main aspects today. One is inclusiveness. One is international environmental agreements used as drivers. And third one is appropriate use of standards. So starting from the first one, inclusiveness. Well, standardization is typically a process made by industry and for the industry. And most times, actually quite often, the voices of the outside world is unheard. So I'm talking about civil society, indigenous peoples groups, but also since we're talking about circularity today, we see also lack of presence of circularity operators that could actually bring their expertise in groups, especially in technical groups and technical committees, especially when these thematics are on the table. Inclusiveness for us also means, it does not only mean openness, and in the sense of creating a space where if they want, civil society organizations can actually participate, but it's also about supporting these civil society organizations, make the communication clear, the flow of information quite direct, and also provide a basis for resources and as we know that standardization processes actually take time and a lot of money as well. With this, I also want to mention that actually some steps are being taken. For instance, I saw the International Standards Organization made a clear commitment 3 years ago. Summed up in the London Declaration. So the London Declaration is not only a commitment by ISO to basically base their work on climate science, but they also claim that they need to represent the voices of vulnerable groups and civil society organizations. So that's a big commitment, and we as ECOS totally welcome it. We still know, however, that the main issues still remain within ISO, because ultimately it's not ISO itself as an organization deciding on how inclusive certain groups should be, but rather their national standardization bodies. So these commitments should be done at any level, also at national level. Second, I said I would talk about international environmental agreements and as drivers, and I would just show you this slide. Sorry for I see that it's been resized in this format, but when we talk about international environmental agreements, we really talk about global commitments that should absolutely not being undertaken by a standardization. So standards should be a support for these internationally agreed commitments, and should trickle down to for instance, ISO IC governance, and also to the more daily technical work. And I also had the third pillar, as you remember, the appropriate use of standards, but we can also keep using this slide. The appropriate use of standards also refer to this. So standards should appropriately be used. And what we mean with that is that standards should support and not hinder regulation. So there should always be, they should always set the how and not the what, not the why. These are laws and policies that should do that. And with this, I also want to mention that social aspects that are the more and more discussed at the standardization table should remain probably and should be more appropriately discussed at regulatory and policy level. Finally, I will just give, because we have been talking about international standards and circularity, but I haven't really said what could the standards be. We have actually worked for a very long time at ECOS, especially at European level, on standards that would support policies to set clear guidance and definitions for circularity, and ultimately to keep critical minerals longer in use, which is what would also reduce pressure on mining regions. And we also think that if what I said earlier, so about everything about inclusiveness and the appropriate use of standards is actually respected, then we could also, all these standards could actually also be an opportunity for mining regions. So first of all, we have standards that could assess performance. We're seeing now it now at the in the European standardization discussions. There are long discussions on how to assess performance of batteries, so that their the critical minerals used in batteries can last more. We have worked on standards that through design would facilitate repair, reuse, and recycling. Another example is standards on interoperability of processes. So this would, knowing how processes are done, and harmonization of these processes could actually decrease information costs in trade, and help mining regions getting up to speed with circularity practices. Another very important goal that standardization can achieve is the labeling and the flow of information. So this is quite relevant for critical raw materials and critical minerals, because they can actually standards that can actually set up a common language for different materials used in products, so that the information doesn't get lost along the supply chain. And then Last but not least, I mentioned product-specific standards, which can go even deeper and set up circularity practices for each product. So I mentioned batteries, but there are other standards for instance, electronic products, computers, smartphones, and anything that could actually keep CRMs longer in use. And finally, this is really my last point. I would just mention supply chain standards, which are a new thing at ISO especially. So ISO, the International Standardization Organization, is working and will soon start work on certain standards on setting the sustainability, what we mean by sustainability in the supply chain of critical minerals. And this could actually be a good step forward if, again, all the steps that I mentioned earlier are fulfilled. So if civil society, indigenous groups have a voice in setting these supply chain standards, which aim to be covering the full supply chain of all critical minerals and metals. So it's quite a broad intention. Now it's just an intention because, as I said, discussions will start next month. But that's also something that could be very good, and it could also be very bad if certain voices are not represented properly. And with this, I think I'm up.
Thank you very much, Rita and Olaf, for your presentations. I have just two quick questions, and then we'll open up the floor. One quick question for you, Olaf. Some recent research from Publish What You Pay just came out, I think last week. They suggested that when we're talking about value addition, that industrial policies that promote trade in the material need for batteries, solar panels, and other clean energies could boost Africa's GDP by at least 24 billion a year and create at least an extra 2.3 million jobs on the continent. This, of course, would require many African economies to move away from primary resource extraction into now manufacturing, right? So in this sense, what do you see, since you're working now on EU policy and from a European perspective, what can the EU offer to Global South countries in terms of these partnerships to allow for their industrialization, but also at the same time allow for the raw material needs the EU seeks?
Yeah. I think there's two questions there. First, what can the EU do to facilitate industrial policy? Well, I think maybe in a sense, the Critical Raw Materials Act can be a good step in that direction, because there is at least a framework in which there can be finance for that, like projects can be financed. So I think that is one of the ways in which it could be done. Like another one, and I already talked about this. I mean, another one is just, I think European Union is responsible for about 30% of tax evasion, something like that. So avoidance, I should say. Sorry. So I mean, if it fixes that, I mean, how much money will stay in countries? How many more government funding will countries have in order to stimulate their own industrial policy? Because now, with these strategic partnerships, I mean, you can say like, okay, there is a need for investment, and the EU is providing that, and that is to some extent, of course, true. But also it then happens at the moment when it's the EU that's at the that's in control, basically. So the EU can say, okay, we fund this, but we don't fund that, and simultaneously it will be EU taxpayers that are going to pay for that. And we looked a little bit into the Lobito corridor, which is one of the biggest projects that the EU is going to fund. It's a railway connecting Angola, Zambia, and the DRC, specifically to the copper belt region in Zambia and the DRC, which is where there's copper and cobalt. But we looked into that, and I think there were estimations that it would cost, wrote it down somewhere. It would cost 2.8 billion euros in a 5-year period. But we've looked at some reports, for instance, by Oxfam, which said that Zambia loses about 560 million a year due to tax avoidance. Now, in a 5-year period, that's already the amount that that is needed for the Lobito corridor. So yeah, I think if I'm going to be honest, I think it's that. It's that's what they should fix, and that's the most important thing. There was also a second question. Did I answer that?
Yeah, you answered the one on no, I just had one question.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Then
And okay, so that's really interesting. I think the perspective of, you know, we're talking about public investment going to, or private investment as well, going into these strategic projects, which the list is now being assessed by the European Commission. And then that means that there is a fear of that risk of this money going to these projects, and the gains from that project would be shifted off to private hands and not necessarily fulfilling the needs not only of the host countries, but also the communities impacted. So that's an interesting perspective, and I hope that some people in the audience also have some points as well to share. But then also last question over to you, Rita. So we know that in the energy and raw materials chapters within free trade agreements from the EU, the focus on sustainability is rather related to critical raw material sourcing is rather weak. In this sense, it's not enforceable in many ways. By that I mean, there's not really necessarily a requirement for environmental impact assessments within the energy and raw materials chapters. And this poses a serious issues of what projects will be going through without proper environmental and governance. Now, I will add even that when there is some mention of EIAs or environmental impacts, the focus is largely on environmental impacts and not enough on social impacts. And that is really, or human rights impacts, let's say. And that is really a missing piece. Your organization, ECHOS, has done a lot of work on standardization. There's one current standards being proposed by ISO. I think it's PC 348, if I'm not mistaken, which would incorporate social impacts within the ISO process. I'm wondering if this could be a tool for ISO to propose for these projects that within the energy raw materials chapters that do not incorporate social impacts. Is there a danger even if it were to be such a pursuit as such? What do you think?
Yeah, I think I go again back to what I said earlier. So there is this part of making sure that all the voices are heard and the expertise is well represented. So it's and with expertise in this case, as soon as we start talking about social aspects, is expertise of human rights advocates or social social aspects, people that are expert in these social dynamics of related to mining and so on. So I think that's really one type of expertise that is usually not the typical expertise that you find at ISO, which still remains and has been quite a technical body. So it's we're now also discussing internally ethicals on how to bring up that forward, discussing with ISO, and I think that there is probably maybe a change that should be done within ISO also, and how they again how and in the pool of experts that they have, because if they want to start if standards are starting to cover the full supply chain, including social aspects, then that needs to be properly represented. And then, of course, apart from the most of the experts or human rights experts are already there, and they are in civil society organizations, and as we know, they're not necessarily being they're not necessarily being involved in the process all the time, be it for historical reasons, because there was never maybe the need, because again the subjects were so technical. But now that everything is evolving, I think it's also time has come for these voices to be also progressively included.
Okay, thank you for that, Rita. And also, maybe I'll just add to that, when it comes to these social impacts, there is luckily international law that already dictates how countries should administer these impacts, particularly when it comes to indigenous people. There's the UN DRIP, there's ILO 169, though not a lot of countries have ratified ILO 169. UN DRIP is still signed by many countries, even more. That originally opposed ILO 169, for example. So that is also, international law needs to be an aspect of of assessing these partnerships. But then the issue is, of course, implementation of this law. What looks good in the books is not necessarily what happens on the ground, right? So with that, with this discussion, I mean, it's a complicated discussion, of course, because as I mentioned in my first presentation, there is a puzzle at this moment. We need some of these materials for the energy and transition, economic development, what have you. But then at the same point, they do have a huge ecological cost that is many times undermined, underreported, and not necessarily understood. And at this point, in this impasse, we not neglecting or undermining these impacts could fuel more anti-extractive resistance, right? So we need to have a more collective approach on how to reduce the amount of materials needed, not necessarily as an environmental argument, but it's now also demand-side measures could be used as a security of supply argument, which at this moment is dominating policy discussion. So with that, I would like to open up the floor. We have just 20 minutes. We're good on time. So with what was said today, yeah, we don't have the other two presenters, sadly, but so we have a little bit more time for discussion. So yeah, I open up the floor for anyone that wants to come in. Usually is the case that people are a bit shy in the beginning and then kind of build up. So who wants to be? Yes, back there. Maybe the mic works.
Thanks. And sorry, I came in late, so I'm not sure if you already addressed this, but do you all on the panel have thoughts on this UN panel on minerals and some recommendations for that? And how do you see that interacting with the WTO?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. Does anyone here has followed that process? So this process on it's a great question, and should it be properly addressed here? None of us three have actually worked directly on it because some of our NGO. Oh, I see a representative from Climate Action Europe, Climate Action Network Europe is here. So please do come in.
So actually, we do work in the same coalition, and we've been following via Climate Action Network International because they were one of the civil society members of the panel, one of two, so very few civil society voices. Generally, so it's been published yesterday or so. Generally, it's welcome, especially by the human rights organization, also climate organizations, because there's specific mention on like principles on environmental integrity, protecting environmental defenders, etc. On trade, it's very weak. And that's like the biggest letdown on, I can go into details, but I think I might be like maybe zeroing in too much, but on trade, there is a huge gap, and there was a lot of resistance on the panel to include specific principles around trade and also on investment protections, because those are linked. Something I'm forgetting to mention, and it's coming to me. But yeah, that's the first reaction to that. I think there wasn't a clear mandate to the WTO to maybe look into its rules and make them more, adjust them to current developments, especially like Indonesia, like having the EU win that case against Indonesia is, I think it's an indictment against the rules and how it's working against these resource-rich countries. So there needs to be something that's changing there. But the principles document really defers to WTO and like does not touch it. So yeah, that's what I can say.
On that point as well, with the Raw Materials Coalition, we will be releasing a reaction, which will come out, I believe, tomorrow already. Publish What You Pay already has, with many different organizations as well, published their own assessment back in July. This is, of course, 3 months ago, so a lot of things have changed. But one on the topic of today, for example, on circular economy and demand side solutions, that is quite weak. It has been hard fought to include even a recommendation for the global north to take much more of a priority of reducing its material consumption and production via circular economy mechanisms and non-circular market mechanisms necessarily. But this has been largely pushed by global north countries. And this also reflects, since we're at WTO, we're talking about global governance here. This is also reflected at UNEA 6, sorry, where the circular economy resolution did not go through. And this is a big opportunity loss, being the case that many countries were thinking that, why should we talk about reducing consumption and production in the global north? It was just really a tense subject. However, just to give you an idea what this means, it means a lot of people think about demand side solutions as looking at it from that it would reduce well-being. What we're actually asking for is well-being would be increased by demand side solutions. I just got back from Peru recently, where I'm from, and Lima is a city saturated by individual car use, right? Which increases huge social costs, not only because of environmental impacts, also brings up rent prices because there's a less area to build houses. So you reduce the supply of housing. And also a third one that the country has to, the city has to maintain the roads and all of that. So huge social costs. And this is not very analyzed when it comes to urban policies and urban management. And tied to that, most of the demand from critical raw materials is actually associated with the mobility sector, right? I'm not talking about trains, I'm talking about private vehicle use. So that's a huge lever that is, again, as I mentioned in my first presentation, completely disregarded in current policy spaces. And this is what we're calling for, that it needs to be addressed. But thank you for your question on UNSG. Maybe other questions as well. We still have a few more times. Yeah, 1 and 2.
So from circularity argument point of view, and especially if you take global north, many times I feel that I work on circular economy, especially for energy materials. So many times I feel that it is mostly external factors which sort of play a role in the developing countries or wherever the critical materials are, for example, Latin America or other. Still the uptake from the local communities, that why it is important for the local communities, the circularity argument has not been taken. And as you said, you're from Peru, so probably you'll agree on that. It has not been taken from the local communities, from the local governments and local people. What do you think that why it is so, and how, the people in this room or people in WT or other UN organizations can enhance that uptake from the local people for the local factors? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. I didn't catch your name, but
I'm Shahid.
okay, Shahid. Thank you very much. Does anyone want to take that question? It's more like a bottom-up approach, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not completely familiar with what that local approach is. So you're saying it's more bottom up. So
Well, sorry. In this sense, that what you're referring to now is something that we actually heard at UNEA 6 as well. The Global South countries were seeing the resolution is just another global north imposition upon us. And it might have been the case because the resolution was promoted by the European Union, right? So there is that dynamic. However, I would argue that circular economy is actually happening to a very high level in the global south, particularly in India, Colombia, Brazil, but it's usually within the informal sector, right? And it's usually the waste pickers that are that are collecting the material that is then used by larger companies to recycle it, what have you. And there is a debate about what should we do in terms of formalization? Should we formalize? Should we not formalize? Because it's really complicated. On the trade dynamics, I don't have a point on that. And actually, I think our colleague Jessica would have been much better addressed to point that out. But I just wanted to basically, reiterate your point that at the moment so far, circular economy is seen very much as a global north initiative. However, I think there's from capitals within the global south, there's also antagonization towards its own informal sector, and even as a means to eradicate it. So what that does is that it neglects the fact that circular economy is also happening in the global south. So I don't have a complete answer for that, but it's a dynamic that needs to be explored. And hopefully UNEA 7, some country in the global south could propose a circular economy resolution, which much more bottom-up approaches. Remains to be seen. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just also that's also a dynamic that we see a lot in standardization, where again, as I said, circular economy is not very operators and workers are not very well represented. So there's already that factor, but also it also still remains mostly global north. Especially we could see the this supply chain standard that I referred to and that you also repeated earlier. That's we also again see where the main participants are coming from, and so that's also something that should be enhanced, so that practices that are maybe coming from the countries that Diego was mentioning earlier can be put up and be standardized and be mainstreamed also at that level.
So for the standardization perspective, so, do you think that the standardization, once the standards goes from global north to global south, don't you think that the standards should be organized or made in accordance or in discussions with the global south as well? Because what happens is that, many times we make the standards in Europe or in the global north. And sometimes it is very, very difficult because, I work in both areas, so I know that. So it becomes very, very difficult to comply to those standards. And eventually there are more sort of corrupt uh, practices happening. So I think the circular economy agenda, it's sort of new. I mean, it's not very new, but still. So I think taking both of the perspective from implementation point of view, it's very, very important as well. Yeah.
I agree with you. That's also what we see, and it's a lack of participation, but also because why Global South is not participating in standardization is because of, again, lack of resources, lack of time. Most of the meetings happen in Global North, I have to say. So yeah, that's absolutely an issue.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Belen Gracia, PhD candidate at Maastricht University, and I'm working in international law and the circular economy. That's what my research focus on. I found the presentations very enlightening and very interesting, so thank you. And I was hoping to hear a little bit more about from Olaf, because I thought, like, I always associate the Critical Raw Materials Act more than with a Green Deal, with the EU strategic autonomy, right? But of course, there is a component of circular economy there. And perhaps in these strategic partnerships, MOUs, memorandums of understanding that the EU has recently been negotiating with some countries, specifically in Latin America, it's the first time that we are actually seeing the mention into circularity and circular economy and the regulation of the complete value chain in those instruments. And I noticed that you actually pointed out that these mechanisms don't have an enforceable mechanism, and this is one of the critiques. What do you think that this is not viable to contribute to a circular economy? But don't you think, or haven't you thought that this should be read in the context with other instruments? Because, for example, the MOUs that the MOU that the EU signed with Chile is, we shouldn't read it in isolation. We should read it together with the FTA that the EU actually has with Chile, and the new FTA, where you have a chapter on raw materials, and you also have an enforceable mechanism there, perhaps one of the first enforceable on TSD issues mechanism. So if you read it in that context, don't you think that, well, actually we can have some policy tool that can help at least be better for what we had before to promote circularity? And in terms of tax avoidance, that is kind of like a complicated issue because it's more related to tax policy and also to the tax policy in the states where these critical raw materials are extracted. And where do we draw the line between interfering on the policies that those countries have the right to take, the right to regulate, right? And the imposition on how they should organize their tax and financial systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, to the extent to if the strategic partnership a step in a good direction, I think that it also remains to be seen. I mean, the one with Chile that you mentioned is quite recent, so we also are not, we don't know yet how it's going to play out. The reason why we focus so much on tax evasion or avoidance is also because we think that it is related to the trading system in terms of where the gains end up, and especially if the government is actively going to encourage projects, like it's kind of a a dual role to both encourage it and simultaneously take such a huge part of the global tax avoidance. I do agree with you that I mean these are to some extent separate issues, and it's also of course the EU's own or the country's own jurisdiction. But on the other hand, there's a lot of the EU interferes in a lot of domestic policy. So, for instance, in terms of budget deficits, domestic policy, domestic environmental policy. So I don't see a reason why that should not be part of something that the EU does.
To come in on that point as well, I think an aspect of the circular economy that is absolutely needed is a reference on skills and how and direct actual guidance on how these skills are going to be integrated within these economies. Because right now the EU has a skills problem. We are just not producing the engineers that China has, for example. So if the EU, with all of its financial capacity, has issues on skilling and gaining this particular expertise on circular matters, how can countries of the global south do that? And that will require, of course, well, one, financial contribution, and would also require technological transfers. And in some cases, this can be done through joint ventures. You know, that is how China also was able to increase its ability to move past the or the middle income, overcome the middle income trap, let's say. So in that sense, I think the skilling is really important, and it's one subject that is largely I wouldn't say neglected, but it's much less thought out as other market mechanisms, for example. And then on the topic of Chile or circular economy that we didn't really mention, and maybe I'll just close with this one, is on extractive waste. So this topic of extractive waste, there's much legacy mines out there in the world, particularly in Australia, many African countries and Latin American countries, many of them already happening from the 1990s, sometimes even from mines in the 1990s that are closing now, but even before, ancient legacy mines as well, which are just polluting and just sitting there, not having neither an economic benefit or an environmental, fixing the environmental impacts of them. However, what I want to also add to your point is that in the Circular Economy Action Plan, this is actually going to be, has an article to increase recycling of materials within extractive waste. And some memorandums of understanding, particularly the one in Australia, has a specific reference on or revalorization of mining waste. But I'm not seeing that also in other countries. And this will require massive amounts of investments because, you know, it's new technologies, right? Will require massive amounts of new skills. And I see that in the memorandum of understanding with Australia, yet I'm not seeing that in the memorandum of understanding with other countries. I don't know if it's in the Chile one, definitely not seeing that in the Kazakhstan one as well. So this is another point where global South countries could be pushed up into the global value chains, you know, through recycling of these materials, but also locally impacting the environmental performance of these legacy mines that are just sitting there not doing really anything. But this does require, of course, I will say, free, prior, and informed consent, because we're talking about reindustrializing an area that has largely been already impacted, and maybe communities have already built their houses next to this mine that was abandoned. So I don't want to say that it's a silver bullet, but it is another way in which global South economies can increase their reduce the impact of mining activities and also increase their manufacturing value added requests. So with that being said, we are now at 2:29, almost 2:30. But I'd like to say thank you very much for coming today to hear this talk. I know this talk on demand side is really not well reflected at this moment in public venues such as this one, but we hope that in the coming years, it will be a much more sought after measure and one of the biggest levers that is largely neglected. So anyway, thank you very much for coming today, and let's talk and see you soon as well.